Karl Malone was 20 years old, impregnated a 13-year-old, got the away from her, nothing to do with the baby.
At 20 years old, Karl Malone fathered a child with a 13-year-old girl, and then he simply walked away. He wanted nothing to do with the baby. Now, from NBA legends to podcast hosts and everyday fans, people are unearthing that dark past, refusing to let his secrets stay buried. But after years of enduring the criticism, the Mailman finally broke, firing back at his accusers in a move that is shattering his own legacy and exposing the deep fractures in the empire he built. Karl Malone is undeniably one of the most dominant power forwards to ever grace a basketball court. He is also quite possibly the most divisive figure in the annals of American sports. Chosen 13th overall by the Utah Jazz in the 1985 draft, the man they called the Mailman. Because he always delivered, forged a career so statistically immense, it borders on the unbelievable. His professional resume is the stuff of legends built on a bedrock of relentless consistency and physical power that spanned decades, allowing him to score 36,928 career points. That number plants him firmly at third on the NBA's all-time scoring list. He also grabbed 14,968 rebounds and seized the league's MVP award twice, first in 1997 and again in '99. His list of accomplishments includes 14 All-Star selections and 11 straight first-team All-NBA honors, a streak only surpassed by LeBron James, plus 3 first-team All-Defensive selections. His psychic connection with point guard John Stockton created the most devastating pick-and-roll attack the sport has ever witnessed, keeping the Jazz in the championship conversation for the better part of 2 decades. The Jazz retired his number 32 in 2006, and he was inducted into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame in 2010 for both his individual prowess and as part of the immortal 1992 Dream Team. 2 Olympic gold medals from the 92 and 96 games also sit in his trophy case. He holds the all-time record for trips to the free throw line, sinking 9,787 of his 13,188 attempts. By any statistical measure that exists in the game of basketball, Karl Malone has earned his place among the immortals. And yet, there is a powerful reason why Malone's name is never spoken with the same quiet reverence afforded to the legends he battled on the court. There is a reason his bronze statue outside the arena in Salt Lake City has become a magnet for protests instead of a shrine for adoring fans. There is a reason that even with 36,000 points to his name, a thunderous chorus from the media and his peers is calling for him to be cast out of the spotlight. Fans who grew up idolizing his every move now demand that the NBA and the Utah Jazz sever all ties and completely deplatform him. And there is a reason that any time Malone offers his opinion on the modern NBA, the conversation instantly shifts from his basketball genius to his flawed moral character. The darkest chapter in this saga began in 1983, before he had logged a single minute of professional play back when he was a 20-year-old sophomore at Louisiana Tech. Malone fathered a child with Gloria Bell, a girl who was only 13 years old when she gave birth to their son. The timeline grows even more disturbing amid reports that conception likely took place when Bell was just 12. In Louisiana, at that time, the age of consent was 17, making this a clear-cut case of a statutory crime against a child. Still, the legal system looked the other way. Investigative pieces by the Salt Lake Tribune and ESPN later uncovered that Gloria Bell's family made the difficult and calculated decision not to pursue criminal charges. They saw a local phenom on the cusp of a multi-million-dollar NBA career and understood that sending him to prison would extinguish any hope of him providing for the child. It was a choice born from economic desperation, a survival tactic that allowed a predator to sidestep justice, trading a prison cell for a life of unimaginable fame and fortune. That child, Demetrius Bell, would later fight his way into the NFL, drafted by the Buffalo Bills in 2008. But he made that difficult journey alone after the Bell family filed a paternity suit in 1986 for a mere $200 a week. Malone's immediate reaction was to deny that the boy even existed. After a Louisiana court ordered a DNA test, the results came back confirming his paternity with absolute scientific certainty. The judge then ordered him to pay a pittance $125 a week, plus past and future medical expenses. He ultimately finalized an out-of-court settlement around 1988 or 89, putting the legal fight to rest. This arrangement allowed him to avoid ever having to publicly acknowledge that he had a son. The move sent an unmistakable message. Karl Malone wanted this problem to vanish, and he was more than willing to write a check to ensure that silence. But the moment that truly solidified his villainous reputation for an entire generation came years later, when a 17-year-old Demetrius Bell reached out to finally meet his biological father. Malone looked him in the eye and told him it was too late. Demetrius later described the encounter with chilling clarity, stating it felt less like meeting a father and more like his mother had made a withdrawal from a sperm bank. That one cold-blooded dismissal has become the defining detail in every article, documentary, and online discussion about Malone's character. It is a permanent stain that relentlessly follows him, showing zero indication of ever fading from public memory. Recently, one of the most raw and unfiltered analyses of this history came from a podcast whose hosts refused to soften the harsh reality. They made it plain that the damage wasn't just a result of his absence. It was about his active and direct cruelty. The hosts recounted the details of that meeting, which was 17 years in the making, concluding that Malone's words were arguably more destructive than his silence had ever been. He meets the kid 17 years later when he's 17 years old, and he says, "Listen, dog, it's too late for me to be a dad to you. You gotta go get it out the mud, get it on your own." When you step back and analyze the architecture of his life, the conclusions about the man beneath the uniform are unforgivingly stark. The tragedy involving Gloria Bell was not an isolated incident in the landscape of his past. It was part of a larger pattern evidenced by the twins Daryl and Cheryl Ford, whom he fathered with Benita Ford when he was still a teenager himself, only 17 years old. By the late 80s, as the gears of a paternity suit began to grind once more, Malone had already climbed to the highest ranks of the NBA. In a tactic that would become a signature move, he initially refused DNA testing, dragging the case through a mire of contempt charges and delays before finally silencing the issue with another private settlement. A deep silence persisted between the father and his children for nearly 2 decades, breaking only around 1998 when the twins, now 17 years old, began to shine as basketball prodigies, suddenly making them worthy of his attention. It was a dark and repeating pattern, fathering children outside of marriage, then instinctively disowning them. He would fight viciously in court to avoid responsibility, only to offer a hollow peace treaty years after the damage was done. And that peace came only when those children had already proven their own worth, leaving a permanent shadow on his name, a stain that history has refused to ignore. But his off-court transgressions were matched by his on-court brutality. He forged a reputation as arguably the most savage enforcer the game had ever seen. That reputation was sealed in blood on December 14, 1991, when he turned his body into a projectile and smashed his elbow directly into Isaiah Thomas's face. The impact was so brutal it took 40 stitches to close the wound. The league's response, a pathetic 1-game suspension and a $10,000 fine, a slap on the wrist that did nothing to curb his aggression. His peers like Dominique Wilkins were unafraid to call out his extreme level of physical violence. In the 1997 Western Conference Finals, even Hakeem Olajuwon condemned the entire Jazz franchise as dirty, a toxic culture that started and ended with Malone's brand of basketball. But the story grows even darker with his public response to another basketball legend, Magic Johnson. When Johnson revealed his HIV diagnosis in 1991 and tried to make a comeback, Malone stood as one of the biggest obstacles in his path. He became the most vocal opponent of Johnson's return, weaponizing fear over imagined health risks to other players and their families. His comments ignited a furious backlash, revealing a shocking lack of compassion during one of the most painful and stigmatized moments in American sports history. Malone used his enormous platform not for good, but to fuel the widespread panic and ignorance surrounding the virus. It was a stance that has been judged mercilessly by history. And just when his list of sins seemed complete, the incident involving Vanessa Bryant surfaced, adding yet another explosive charge to his record. This happened late in his career during the 2003 to 2004 season when he had joined the Los Angeles Lakers for one last shot at a championship. He was now teammates with giants like Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant. But despite being 40 years old and a guest in Kobe's world, Bryant accused him of making deeply inappropriate and suggestive remarks to his wife. Vanessa reported a disturbing comment he made about hunting for young Mexican women. The situation was so undeniable that even Malone's own agent was forced to confirm key details of the disturbing story. The betrayal shattered their professional relationship, sparking a bitter and permanent feud. For a man already haunted by the Gloria Bell scandal, this wasn't just another controversy. It was like throwing gasoline on the raging inferno of public outrage that already surrounded him. And still confronted with this mountain of damning evidence, his involvement with a minor, his refusal to acknowledge his own son, his brutality on the court, his cruelty toward Magic Johnson, and the harassment of a teammate's wife, the NBA, has inexplicably continued to celebrate Karl Malone at its most glamorous events. This staggering moral contradiction sets the stage for the next chapter in this ugly saga. It is a story about the league's deep-seated hypocrisy and the growing number of people who refuse to stay silent. As recently as February of 2023, the league chose Malone to be a celebrity judge for the All-Star Weekend dunk contest, putting him in the spotlight at one of its biggest global events. There he sat smiling for the cameras, praised by commentators as a living legend, as if the dark reality of his personal life had simply vanished. But beyond the arena walls, the public backlash was immediate, furious, and unrelenting. Rolling Stone magazine published a scathing takedown demanding Malone be banned from all future NBA events, carefully detailing the Gloria Bell tragedy, the conflict with Bryant, and the pattern of toxic behavior that should disqualify him from ever being honored again, even in his old stomping grounds. The Salt Lake Tribune ran a powerful editorial insisting the Utah Jazz had to cut all ties and take away his platform. Online, the outrage exploded, but the NBA's official response was nothing but a cold, calculated silence. It fell to independent voices, particularly on podcasts, who had already dug into Malone's history to expose the bizarre reality of his All-Star appearance with the kind of honesty you'd never hear on a major network. They highlighted the stark contrast between Malone's VIP treatment and how another major sports league handles its scandals. A league that, for all its own problems, handled a similar situation in a completely different way. But that just shows you the difference between the NBA and the NFL. How's that? Because Michael Irvin was immediately fired. Irvin was erased from the NFL's Super Bowl coverage the second a harassment allegation was made. There was no conviction, no confirmed evidence, no living, breathing proof of what happened. Just the accusation itself. And yet, there was Karl Malone front and center at the NBA's premier event, despite a well-documented past and a biological son who exists as undeniable proof of what happened back in 1983. Karl Malone's out there when it's proven this is your kid. You have a child walking around who is living proof of a rape. The image was shocking, almost unbelievable. Malone sitting high above the court at the dunk contest, scoring players and judging the next generation. All while the league conveniently ignored the darkness in his own history. And that's when a heavy, unspoken truth hung over the entire event. Not one person in that entire arena had the courage to look him in the eye and speak the truth. Because even years after his retirement, the man is still a terrifying force of nature. He was a force of nature, an imposing figure whose sheer presence dominated the basketball court, a fact the announcers were quick to point out. His legendary career was beyond question, but acknowledging his greatness only made their ethical judgment that much sharper. Then the co-host uttered a single phrase that shattered the image of the revered sports icon, exposing the flawed man underneath and creating a divide that could never be bridged. A single word, legal, brutal, and precise statutory, filled the airwaves, a heavy truth that lingered with chilling permanence. They offered no gentle language, no careful talk of incidents or youthful errors. For the first time on a national broadcast, they spoke the grim reality that the sports world had only dared to mention in hushed tones for decades. When the discussion shifted to why nobody ever confronts Malone directly, the explanation given was blunt and stripped of all pleasantries. Their words revealed a system that has enabled Malone to move through the NBA's world without consequence, shielding him from any real accountability for 40 years. It all boils down to pure intimidation. Even in his 60s, his colossal build is an unspoken threat to anyone who considers speaking out. The fury against him stays safely trapped in the digital realm, expressed through angry keystrokes and podcast rants broadcast from a safe distance. Not a single person has the nerve to approach Karl Malone and say to his face what thousands declare about him online are dynamic. The host laid bare with unflinching surgical honesty. That one insight cuts to the heart of how Malone has maintained his standing among the league's elite, despite the shadow of controversy that has dogged him for most of his adult life. The organization itself provides a shield, and basic human self-preservation does the rest. While countless people are bold in their condemnation from behind a screen, that courage instantly disappears when a 6'9", 260-pound Hall of Famer is staring them down with shoulders that look as wide as they did in 1997. It is that massive gap between online anger and a real-life showdown that gives the NBA permission to continue welcoming him with open arms. So long as no one disrupts the calm in the real world, the league can maintain the convenient illusion that the controversy doesn't even exist. The league's determination to keep Malone in the spotlight, however, unintentionally exposed another uncomfortable truth, casting a new light on his turbulent and often hostile history with the Utah Jazz organization after his playing days were over. It's a connection that has been anything but peaceful. In 2012, Malone unleashed a public tirade against the franchise over their handling of the conflict between star player Deron Williams and the iconic coach Jerry Sloan, claiming the organization had sided with the player and sacrificed a coaching legend in the process. Greg Miller, who owned the team at the time, shot back immediately, issuing a public statement that labeled Malone as unstable, untrustworthy, and fundamentally dishonest. It was an astounding break from the norm, an owner publicly blasting the most celebrated player in his team's history with a frankness almost unheard of in professional sports. Rumors also circulated that Malone had tried to get a coaching position with the team, only to be politely but firmly rejected by the very franchise he had once defined. Eventually, emotions cooled, and by the time the Jazz celebrated their 50th anniversary season in 2024, Malone had been brought back into the team's public life, placed front and center during the festivities, which ignited a fresh wave of outrage from the media and fans online, all asking why the organization continued to embrace a man whose very participation made the entire event feel shockingly insensitive. Each time the subject of public anger comes up, Malone has retreated behind a wall of pure denial. A posture that has only fanned the flames of controversy. In a string of 2023 interviews, he dismissed questions about his past with dismissive comments like, "I don't care," or "whatever," followed by the weak justification that he was only human. Not once has he ever publicly shown remorse for what happened in 1983. There has been no deep reflection and no official apology offered to Gloria Bell. There has been zero public admission of guilt. No accountability at all outside of the court-ordered child support payments he originally fought relentlessly to avoid. And so Karl Malone continues to exist in a bizarre state of limbo, caught in a space where his on-court achievements are too immense to ever be erased from history. But his personal history is too toxic for the league that made him a star to ever fully celebrate him. A bronze statue of him still stands outside the Delta Center in Salt Lake City, a permanent monument of metal. His jersey number is still retired, hanging forever in the arena. But his legacy, that invisible quality that transforms statistics into adoration, has been slowly disintegrating, worn down over the years by every new podcast and viral video. The court of public opinion is delivering its slow, painful sentence. While Malone kept his silence on his public standing through 2025 and into 2026, the basketball world was consumed with debate over his legacy and character. And then he launched his counterattack, aiming his criticism squarely at LeBron James, igniting a whole new front in the war for his own reputation. If the scandals from Karl Malone's past have been a gradual erosion of his public standing, his recent televised critique of LeBron James was a deliberately thrown knockout punch. It was a calculated play to reposition himself as a heavyweight basketball mind, a voice that must be acknowledged in the debate over the greatest of all time. He was trying to command respect regardless of the shadows that loom over his life away from the game. And whether one agrees with his analysis or rejects it entirely, a single undeniable truth remains. The second he started talking, the entire basketball world went quiet, every fan and critic pausing to absorb what he had to say. It all started in January of 2025. Karl Malone sat down for what was promoted as a routine, nostalgic interview with a major sports network. The show's producers were certainly anticipating an easygoing conversation about the old days, full of warm stories about the legendary Stockton to Malone connection. Maybe some funny stories from the locker room and a few respectful thoughts on today's game. They likely expected him to offer a polite and gracious acknowledgement of the new crop of superstars. What they got was a man who stared directly into the camera, his gaze piercing and relentless, as he began a methodical, almost clinical dismantling of LeBron James's case for being the greatest player in the history of the sport. There was no politeness, no careful wording. He wasn't hiding behind the usual guarded compliments retired legends use to avoid making waves. Malone came out swinging, cutting directly to the core of the argument. He opened by establishing the fundamental question that sits at the center of the entire debate. So what is the criteria, man? Because this is the argument I have today. Like, a better player is one thing. Well, yeah. Like, is he just, let's strip away every award? He separated raw athletic dominance and the sheer volume of career statistics into one distinct box, but argued that earning the title of the greatest ever was judged by an entirely different standard. A standard that LeBron's 4 wins and 6 losses in the finals made it impossible for him to meet. He then pivoted to the benchmark that he felt was the only true measure of undeniable basketball supremacy. He invoked Michael Jordan's perfect 6-0 record on the game's biggest stage complete with his 6 finals MVP awards and the devastating fact that the dynasty he built rarely needed a 7th game to close out a championship. That was the relentless, unforgiving standard Malone held up against any player aspiring to challenge the ghost from Chicago. This wasn't a simple comparison of statistics on a page. It was a dissection of mindset, of competitive DNA, and of the deep-seated psychological wiring that separates the legends from the icons. Malone then focused his attack on what he saw as the foundational flaw in LeBron's career narrative, the creation of the super team. He presented the timeline with the sharp precision of a prosecutor laying out an airtight case for the jury. For 7 long years during his initial run in Cleveland, he came away with 0 championships. And then came the decision. LeBron famously declared on national television that he was taking his talents to Miami to team up with Dwyane Wade and Chris Bosh, 2 elite superstars in the prime of their careers. But even with a roster engineered for dominance, LeBron only managed a 50% success rate in Miami, winning just 2 championships in 4 trips to the finals. When that alliance dissolved, he engineered a return to Cleveland, but only after management brought in Kevin Love, adding another all-star to tilt the scales in his favor. That move produced just a single title before LeBron departed yet again. His new home was Los Angeles, where a top 5 talent Anthony Davis was already in place to join him. At every stage of his career, a pre-packaged all-star teammate was there to help shoulder the championship burden. The career path of Michael Jordan, meanwhile, offered a stark and brutal contrast. He stayed and fought in the trenches with Chicago through every agonizing loss, every bitter disappointment, and every soul-crushing playoff defeat. He never considered running to Detroit to join Isaiah Thomas. He never tried to form a super team with Magic Johnson or Larry Bird to make his journey easier. He stayed put to vanquish those giants. He took a raw, untested rookie named Scottie Pippen and through sheer force of will molded him into a Hall of Fame partner. He single-handedly elevated the Bulls from a forgotten franchise into the most dominant force the sport had ever seen. And he accomplished it all without ever taking off that Chicago jersey. That, Malone proclaimed, is the unbridgeable gap between being great and being the greatest. Then he went for the jugular performance in the clutch. He was talking about those do-or-die legacy-making moments when the clock is ticking away, the score is tied, and every person watching knows exactly whose hands the ball will be in. Malone spoke of how titans like Jordan and Kobe Bryant didn't just accept that suffocating pressure, they thrived on it. It was the air they breathed. You could see the fire in their eyes when an entire season's work came down to one final possession. That killer instinct, that primal need to be the one to plunge the dagger into the opponent's heart, was what set the true predators apart from the pack. And that's when Malone asked the piercing question that LeBron's most passionate defenders hate to address. How many times did we see LeBron pass up that final shot? How many times in a critical moment did he defer to a role player making a calculated decision to avoid the potential blame if the shot didn't fall? Finally, he delivered the knockout blow he knew would inflict the most damage, the historic meltdown in the 2011 NBA Finals. LeBron's Miami Heat were the heavy favorites to dismantle an older Dallas Mavericks team led by Dirk Nowitzki. The stage was set for his coronation the moment LeBron was supposed to silence his critics and prove his controversial decision to leave Cleveland was the right one. Instead, LeBron vanished, averaging under 18 points per game in the series, the lowest finals scoring average of his entire career. In the fourth quarter of those games, the exact moments when superstars are meant to rise and bend the game to their will, LeBron looked lost, tentative, and shockingly reluctant to demand the shots that a player of his supposed caliber should have been taking. Dallas captured the title in 6 games. Role players like Jason Terry and Sean Marion played with more fire and more confidence than the man who had spent the previous summer anointing himself as part of a new dynasty. Malone didn't soften the blow. He stripped away the excuses and called it a catastrophic failure under the brightest lights imaginable. He argued that this collapse is forever burned into LeBron's story, a deep and permanent scar that no amount of highlight reels or statistical achievements can ever completely conceal. But what gave Malone's words such a sharp, unforgiving edge was the personal perspective he was speaking from. This wasn't a judgment from a man who had never faced that kind of pressure, someone looking down from a throne of championship rings. Karl Malone understands with a painful and personal clarity the sheer agony of coming up short when the entire world is watching and the stakes are at their absolute highest. He clawed his way to the mountaintop in 1997 and 1998, only to be thrown off by the god of basketball himself, Michael Jordan. For almost 20 years, his numbers were law, his control of the paint absolute. But he left the game empty-handed, missing the championship ring that separates legends from immortals. Still, the words, "I'm the greatest," never passed his lips. That refusal to crown himself is what gives his argument its raw, undeniable power. This was not a king speaking from a throne. It was a warrior scarred and weathered from battle, a man who learned the hard way to distinguish true greatness from media-fueled fantasy. He's tasted the ashes of final-round defeat, and he believes that agonizing experience grants him a unique authority to declare that LeBron's supposed kingdom turns to dust when held up to the light of history. When Malone publicly took apart the myth of the king on live television, the fallout was immediate and catastrophic, splitting the world of basketball right down the middle. Social media became a war zone, a chaotic storm of viral clips and scorching hot takes that burned across the internet like a wildfire. An army of YouTube creators launched analytical deep dives, their thumbnails screaming about how Malone broke the internet and the view counts exploded into the millions practically overnight. Yet through all the noise and fury, the most powerful reaction to Malone's brutal honesty was the one that never came. LeBron James, a man notoriously active online who opines on everything from world affairs to what he ate for lunch, suddenly vanished. Not a single subliminal tweet, not one cryptic post on Instagram. And from his agent Rich Paul and the rest of his notoriously loud inner circle, there was nothing but deafening silence. The massive public relations engine and operation that usually spins any negative story into gold ground to a complete and sudden halt. The quiet was thick, suffocating, and that profound lack of a counter-argument spoke louder than any carefully crafted press release ever could. Then in the following weeks, other giants of the game began to signal their agreement using subtle social media likes and quiet affirmations to cast doubt on LeBron's place in the pantheon. They spoke in code-dropping hints about the rare championship DNA and the iron will it takes to conquer the sport's highest peak. Malone had merely dared to say out loud what the old guard had been whispering behind closed doors for more than a decade. By shattering that silence, he unleashed a tidal wave, fundamentally altering the public discourse in a way that Team LeBron and their media allies were powerless to control. But one fact remains absolutely certain: the final chapter of Karl Malone's story is still being written. His legacy is a brutal tug-of-war fought between fans who idolize his on-court mastery and those who will never allow the dark corners of his private life to be ignored. The Mailman may have retired his uniform 2 decades ago, but the battle over his memory burns hotter than ever. We're deep in the final quarter of this fight, with no end in sight. And looking at the fallout today, it is impossible to know who will emerge victorious in the eyes of history. I appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to click the other videos on your screen for more deep dives into the game.